This is the Brazil Institute podcast, brought to you by the Wilson Center. I'm your host, Anya Prusa. Today we are joined by Fernando Cutz. He's a global fellow at the Wilson Center, an expert in U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. We discuss the impact of the coronavirus on Brazil, the country's response, and what it could mean for Brazil's relationship with the United States and China. Well, Fernando, thank you so much for joining us on the Brazil Institute podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me, Anya.
So, the coronavirus is first and foremost a public health crisis in Brazil and around the world, but we know that there's going to be economic and political fallout. What do you make of the growing political isolation of President Bolsonaro, even as his ministers, the National Congress, and state governors are taking action?
Yeah, there's no doubt that there will be ramifications to the actions that President Bolsonaro is taking right now. First and foremost, it's a real tragedy from a public health perspective to be receiving mixed messages when you think about the amount of Brazilians who are relying on their leadership and their public officials to guide them through this crisis. Folks who of course lack the public health education that most of us lack, but on top of that, there are a lot of folks in Brazil who lack some basic education and will really kind of look to leadership to tell them what to do. And you have the vast majority of leaders in the country, from city and local officials in most municipalities to state government officials, certainly most governors in the country, to the ministers around the federal government, guiding them in the right direction. But then at the top, the very top, of course, with all the attention and publicity that generates, you have a president who's sending a very mixed message on how seriously to take this, what actions to take. And unfortunately, again, first and foremost, I think that could be a real humanitarian problem for the country, and hopefully not a crisis, but certainly not a positive step. As far as the economic consequences of his decision making, I think the more isolated that President Bolsonaro makes himself, and he certainly appears to be moving in the direction of isolation, not away from it, the more challenging it will be for him to carry a whole lot of weight when he speaks on behalf of the country later on, and does try to kickstart the economy again. And that means that when he goes to the World Bank or the IMF, when he goes to bilateral meetings with other heads of state throughout the region and throughout the world, and even domestically as he engages with business leaders to try to convince them to invest and double down in Brazil, or to bring in foreign direct investment, when there isn't a whole lot of stability in your government, when there isn't a whole lot of faith that you will necessarily even stay in your position. We've seen this, especially with Brazil, time and again, right? With Dilma, most recently also with Temer. If Bolsonaro puts himself in that position now, barely a year and a half into his administration, well, that sets up a long and a prolonged, unnecessarily prolonged period of economic recovery for a country that simply can't afford it.
Now, I know President Bolsonaro and President Trump have spoken recently, and of course they had dinner back in early March, shortly after many of Bolsonaro's delegation actually tested positive for the coronavirus. The mayor of Miami did as well, and several other people who were present. What do you think of their personal relationship right now? Where does it stand?
Well, I don't know that President Trump necessarily blames President Bolsonaro for anything specifically. I think there could have very well been some sort of personal strain in the relationship had President Trump or somebody that's very close to President Trump, including all of his family members who were also present at that dinner at Mar-a-Lago, if they had personally gotten COVID-19 from one of those interactions. Now, given that they all walked away without it, I think he's kind of fine. And in a way, I think President Trump, while he has actually been more responsible than President Bolsonaro as far as how much he's listened to his cabinet members and public health officials here in the country, I think he certainly showed, and he certainly has some of the very similar tendencies as President Bolsonaro, as far as playing down the importance of the virus, playing down the effectiveness of social, or the need for kind of the social isolation, and wanting business to be rebooted as quickly as possible. So I imagine that he's looking down at Brazil, and he's looking down in Mexico and seeing AMLO do some similar things. And I imagine he kind of feels compelled to defend them, and feels like they are similarly minded in that sense.
And do you think Bolsonaro has been looking to President Trump for cues on how to respond, or is this simply the fact that both leaders have very similar political styles?
At first, I actually thought that President Bolsonaro was looking to President Trump to kind of lead on this, and then he was kind of taking his cues from President Trump. It certainly appeared that way, and it tracks with President Bolsonaro's, I think, general style and the way that he makes a lot of key policy decisions in Brazil. Having said that, since that time, we've seen the two take a very different turn. President Trump did, in his defense here, he did after a while, but after kind of seeing enough numbers and enough charts that seemed to scare him, he changed his tune, and he did start to take the virus a lot more seriously, and he did start to warn the public in much more somber terms to stay home and to do their part and to follow guidelines and all of that. Whereas President Bolsonaro never took that turn. He never kind of came around and started to act in a more responsible way. He, to this day, is still fighting in court for the right to go against the governors and shut down, decide when Brazil should shut down, or in the case of what he wants, decide that Brazil shouldn't be allowed to shut down, that no state has that right. He's still battling his ministers, including his Minister of Health, and what he should or shouldn't be saying, and again, fighting for things to just reopen and be normal. I think just as recently as a few days ago, he called this just a little flu, yet again. So you've seen them, in fact, take quite a bit of a divergent path more recently. And while I think Bolsonaro is doing what President Trump kind of almost wishes he could do, I think President Trump is actually being a little bit more responsible, and perhaps it's more political in the sense that President Trump faces a re-election fight this year. In just a few months, President Bolsonaro has a few years still ahead of him. But still, they have taken quite different paths more recently.
That's a very interesting point about the elections. I wonder, has there been any discussions of cooperation on the coronavirus effort between President Bolsonaro and President Trump, or between the two governments more broadly?
At the top level, I haven't seen it. I think the United States is very focused internally, domestically right now on trying to address the crisis and resolve it as quickly as we can domestically, so that our population, can benefit from it. Now, I think that there are lower level components of the U.S. government that surely will be working quietly and behind the scenes with assistance to other countries. And so I wouldn't be surprised at all if they're at the technical level, there are scientists and doctors and public health officials from the Centers for Disease Control, for example, or the Health and Human Services Agency, or other locations within the U.S. government that are actively trying to collaborate on this, with Brazil and certainly probably with many other countries in the world. Having said that, again, at a top level, at a political level, I don't think that the United States is actively engaged with Brazil on this. And I think, again, to be fair, I don't think the United States is necessarily actively engaged on this at a political level with most any other country in the world.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's a missed opportunity for the United States to not engage, to be focused domestically?
Mm-hmm. It is. Yes, I completely agree. The United States has for a very long time tried to kind of talk the talk of caring about many countries in the world, but particularly the Western Hemisphere, the Latin American countries that we claim to be kind of our region, that we claim to be a key neighborhood for us that we value and care so much about. When other countries, other regional or global powers have kind of sometimes come toward toward this region of the world, the United States will oftentimes kind of try to back them off, right? And that could be Russia, that can be China, that could be other countries where we kind of try to assert that this is our region. This is a region that we take care of, that we work closely with, that we consider to be our friends and allies and neighbors. And yet, I think that friendships and alliances and being a good neighbor, that's easy to do when times are good. I think it's in times of crisis, it's when times are tough that you really find out who your friend and who your good neighbor is. Right now, we're in a time of crisis for the whole world. And certainly there's no country in the world, including in Latin America, that I think wouldn't benefit from greater assistance and collaboration with other countries in the world. Now, I understand that the United States needs to take care of its population, and of course that's the priority domestically here. But I think we have enough capacity in our government to do both, to be taking care of ourselves and our population, while also not necessarily even increasing aid, but at least sharing some of the best practices and some of the scientific advances that we might be making here. So if we don't take advantage of the situation to be a good neighbor and to show that we're actual friends and allies, not just that we say these things when times are easy, then I think other countries in the world could jump in and take this opportunity themselves. And that will be, I think, long remembered, because again, in times of crisis is when I think people really find out who their friends and who their allies really are.
I think China has been one of the countries that everyone has been watching in Latin America as a potential rival to U.S. influence in the region. And certainly we're seeing China now starting to offer some sort of aid through donating masks and other medical supplies. Do you think that this crisis is going to change Brazil's relationship with China in any meaningful way?
Well, yes, I think the Chinese took a very proactive public relations approach to this crisis. In part, it's because they could. The crisis had, by the time the majority of the world started really feeling it, China had really crossed to that curve quite a bit and was almost starting to get back into normal times for them. So they had a little bit more wiggle room. I think in part, it's also because of the perception that exists amongst some folks in the world that this emerged in China, and therefore the Chinese are somewhat to blame because they didn't do enough. And again, whether or not you agree with that, I think the Chinese are worried about that perception being out there and trying to also kind of go above and beyond to some extent. But I think in part, it's also just kind of savviness of PR. Some of the reports I've seen from Brazil is that a lot of the goods and services that the Chinese pledged or offered in very public ways have yet to be delivered. And that's causing a lot of frustration at the government of Brazil's level. And they're quickly finding that some of the items that they thought they could purchase from China, by the government of China, that they would be allowed to purchase, they're actually getting outbidded on, and the Chinese are backing off from purchase orders and sending them to Europe or the United States or other places. So again, I think the PR that China has engaged on here has been very effective, and it's going to be remembered because I think most people just remember the messaging that came out of this, not necessarily the fact that those masks or ventilators or whatever other needs existed never actually showed up to Brazil. But it does show once again what China is. They're an economic player, and their interests oftentimes go to the highest bid. They oftentimes will make some very big promises and not necessarily fully live up to what they claim.
Well, Fernando, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to have you back again soon and maybe talk about a lighter subject next time. The Brazil Institute podcast is produced and edited by Oscar Cruz. To learn more, visit our website, www.wilsoncenter.org/Brazil. Until next time, thanks for listening.